He was replacing the old insulation and had no idea that something was hidden underneath that would turn his whole life upside down. See how this story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The morning began before the sun had even thought of rising. In the small, weathered house at the edge of town, the dim light of the kitchen bulb glowed over a man's hunched shoulders. Michael Harrison stirred a pot of oatmeal, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards that seemed to remember every footstep. The smell of medicine hung faintly in the air. On the counter lay a small pile of bills, some unopened, some already marked overdue. He pushed them aside gently, as though by sparing them his attention, they might disappear. His wife, Emily, was still asleep in the next room. The illness had drained her voice to a whisper and her body to a shadow of what it once was. For years, Michael had watched her fade, one sigh at a time. The only sound that still comforted him was the rhythm of her breathing, fragile, uneven, but there. Every morning, before he left, he stood by the doorway, watching her face in the half-light. He used to kiss her forehead before work, but lately he was afraid of waking her. He would just whisper, "I'll be back before dark," and close the door softly behind him. Outside, the cold morning wrapped around him like a damp coat. The old pickup coughed before the engine caught. The dashboard light flickered weakly as he drove past the sleeping houses. He had built half of them once, back when the town was still growing, before the factory shut down, and before men like him became invisible. But even in silence, Michael found a strange pride in the weight of his days. He was a man of routine, of work done right, of promises kept. Every nail he drove and every beam he leveled carried the same quiet precision he used to care for his family. The job that morning came from a woman he'd never met. Her name was Mrs. Donovan. Her voice over the phone had been soft and careful, the way old voices sound when they come from houses full of memories. She said her attic needed new insulation. The old wool kind, installed before she was born, had finally begun to rot. She warned him it was a dusty place, but the pay was fair and the job simple. He accepted before she finished her sentence. Fair pay was enough these days. There was always something to fix, something to replace, something to buy that insurance didn't cover. When he arrived, the house stood on a quiet street bordered by bare maples. It was the kind of home that might have been elegant once, a large wooden frame, paint faded to gray, shutters leaning, the porch sagging under decades of weather. The windows were clouded from within, as if time had settled on the glass and refused to leave. Mrs. Donovan greeted him at the door. She was small, thin, wrapped in a wool sweater, even though the air inside was still. Her smile was polite, but her eyes looked as though they were searching for someone else entirely. "The attic's up there," she said, pointing to a narrow staircase. "I haven't been there in 50 years. Michael nodded, grabbed his tool bag, and climbed. The air thickened with dust and old paper. The smell was unlike any modern home. It carried the scent of forgotten winters, of mice nests and mothballs, of a house that had been alive too long without laughter. He turned on his headlamp, the beam cutting through floating particles that sparkled like mist. The insulation was the old kind, yellowed, fibrous, packed unevenly between the beams. The floor groaned under his boots. He felt as though every board carried a story, a whisper of the hands that had nailed it down half a century ago. Work steadied him. It always did. With each pull of the scraper and sweep of the brush, the rest of the world Emily's medicine, the unpaid bills, the slow ache in his back fell away. Sweat rolled down his temples as he shoveled away layer after layer of aged wool. His gloves came away brown from dust and time. The light bulb above him flickered weakly, as if reluctant to illuminate the place. Then he noticed it. One plank along the far wall looked wrong. Not just older, but different. It had been fitted tightly, with nails driven in at an angle instead of straight down. The wood was darker, as though heat had brushed it long ago. Michael paused, wiping his brow. He'd worked in hundreds of attics before, replaced miles of flooring. But this felt deliberate. He tapped it lightly with the handle of his hammer. The sound was hollow. He crouched lower, pressing his ear to the floorboard. Beneath it, there was space, empty, confined, perhaps a few inches deep. He hesitated. His first instinct was professional. This wasn't part of the contract. He should leave it alone. But another thought, quieter and older, crept in, the same curiosity that had made him take apart his father's toolbox as a boy, just to see how the locks worked. He looked toward the stairs. No one was watching. He slid the matted insulation aside, wedged the tip of his pry bar under the plank, and leaned his weight. The nail squealed as it rose, and the board lifted a fraction of an inch. Beneath it, dust and darkness. He widened the gap carefully until something caught the light, a corner of metal, dull yellow under the grime. He brushed it with his glove. It was a box, rectangular, about the size of a small briefcase. Rust had eaten into its hinges. A padlock, corroded but intact, sealed it shut. For a long moment, Michael didn't move. The attic was silent except for the slow thud of his heartbeat. He reached down and tried to lift it. The box was heavier than it looked, as though it held not objects, but weight itself. Weight of time, of secrets buried and forgotten. He set it aside gently and replaced the plank over the hole. His throat felt dry, his mind already building questions. Why was it hidden? Who put it there? And why did it feel so strangely personal, as if the house had chosen him to find it? He finished the insulation as dusk began to fade through the attic window. The light outside turned golden, then blue. When he descended, Mrs. Donovan was sitting by the kitchen window, stirring sugar into her tea. She thanked him softly, handed him an envelope with cash, and said she'd call again for more work next month. Her eyes lingered on his hands for a moment, as if recognizing something, perhaps the steadiness of someone who worked without complaint. He wished her a good evening and stepped outside into the cooling air. The box sat on the floor of his truck, half hidden beneath a tarp. He told himself it was nothing more than scrappin' old toolbox, maybe, a jar of nails, or the remains of some forgotten project. Yet, as he drove home, his gaze drifted toward it again and again. Each bump in the road made it shift slightly, like something alive trying to draw his attention. By the time he reached his driveway, the street lamps were glowing. His children's voices carried faintly from inside the house, mixed with the hum of the television. He parked, sat for a moment, and rested his hand on the cold metal surface of the box. It was smooth where the rust had peeled away, almost warm from the heat of the truck. He knew he should leave it in the garage and forget about it. He knew it wasn't his. But something about it refused to let him go. He carried it inside and set it down beside his workbench. The sound it made when it hit the floor was deep and solid. Emily's soft breathing drifted from the next room. He looked toward her, then back at the box. Whatever was locked inside had waited half a century. It could wait one more night. But even as he turned off the light and closed the door, he knew sleep would not come easily. The image of the box lingered behind his eyelids, glinting faintly in the dark, like a secret calling out from beneath the dust of time. The night settled heavy over the small house, thick with the smell of rain and the hum of a tired refrigerator. Michael sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, his rough hands resting against the wood, the faint scrape of his wedding ring catching the light. Through the doorway he could see Emily's room, a pale shape beneath blankets, her chest rising slowly, her breath fragile but steady. He felt both comfort and guilt in that rhythm. the sound of a life that depended on him entirely. The box he had brought home sat on the workbench in the garage, silent, almost watchful. Every time he thought of it, his chest tightened. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. The curiosity was just the foolish echo of boyhood. But something about that old metal container had taken root in his mind, whispering to him through the walls. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The clock on the wall ticked in patient defiance of sleep. His body ached from the day's work, but rest was impossible. Finally, when the silence of the house grew unbearable, he stood up, took the small lamp from the table, and walked into the garage. The single bulb above his head flickered to life, throwing weak yellow light across the tools and sawdust that had become his second world. The box waited on the bench, a dull shape in the half-light. Its surface seemed almost gold beneath the rust, its corners worn smooth by time. He touched it with cautious fingers, feeling the cool metal beneath the grime. The padlock was large and corroded, its shackle swollen shut from years of neglect. He tested it with his hands, pulling gently at first, then harder. It didn't move. He tried a wrench, no give. He fetched the bolt cutters he used for fencing wire, pressing the blades around the lock, and squeezed until his arms trembled. The steel groaned but refused to break. Sweat ran down his temple. Frustration rose in him like heat. He stared at it, breathing heavily, his jaw tight. Then, in a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable, he reached for his grinder. The machine screamed to life, sparks bursting into the air like fireworks. He steadied the blade, lowering it against the rusted seam. The smell of burning metal filled the air, acrid and ancient. When the lid finally gave way, the grinder's roar faded, leaving only the soft hiss of cooling steel. The moment held him still. The world seemed to pause around him. He lifted the lid slowly, half expecting nothing but dust. Inside was something he did not recognize at first. Layer upon layer of tightly packed bundles wrapped in waxed cloth. He pulled one out carefully. It was light, flexible, faintly oily to the touch. He unwrapped it and froze. Inside lay a comic book, its colors vivid despite the decades. Bright blues, deep reds, the thick black lines of ink that had defined a generation's imagination. Across the top, in bold letters that seemed to glow under the light, was written Action Comics #1. His mouth went dry. He'd seen that name once in a magazine, back when he was a boy dreaming of owning something extraordinary. He lifted another. Detective Comics, another Marvel mystery, dated 1939. Each one in pristine condition, perfectly preserved. He felt dizzy. For a long while he could only stare, afraid to breathe too close. These were not just books. They were relics, pieces of history. He turned the pages carefully, feeling the paper resist, crisp but intact. The artwork was astonishing heroes and villains drawn in bold simplicity, words about courage, justice, and impossible odds. He realized that somewhere, years ago, a man had collected these stories and hidden them away as if protecting something sacred. At the bottom of the box, beneath the last bundle, lay an envelope. Its paper had yellowed, its edges soft, but the handwriting on the front was clear and deliberate. To the one who finds this. The ink had faded, but the words carried an unmistakable weight. Michael sat down, his knees weak, and opened it. The letter inside was written in the same careful hand, the lines steady though touched by age. If you are reading this, then you have found what I could not give to my son. He died young, and I had no one left who would understand the worth of what these pages hold. I worked with ink and paper my whole life. These stories kept me alive when the world was cruel and hungry. They are worth more than money. They are reminders that goodness exists, even in fiction. I hope that whoever finds them is someone who works with their hands, someone who knows what it means to build rather than take. Do not waste them. Let them help you in your hour of need, but never forget what they stand for. Michael read it twice, then again, slower, until the words blurred. His hands trembled slightly as he set it down. The letter felt personal, almost as if it had been written for him. He thought of the man who had sealed this box, the life he must have lived, the losses that made him hide away something so beautiful. A printer, maybe, or a dreamer who had spent his life surrounded by paper and ink. The thought filled him with an unexpected sadness. He imagined the man's hands folding each comic carefully, layering them like prayers, sealing the box with a lock meant to outlast his own years. But another feeling followed close behind, one that made him uneasy. These comics were worth something, maybe everything. He didn't know exactly how much, but he knew enough to sense the gravity of what he held. A man could sell even one of these and pay every bill he'd ever owed. He could buy the medicine Emily needed, pay off the mortgage, give the children the security they deserved. Yet the letter's words clung to him. Do not waste them. Let them help you in your hour of need, but never forget what they stand for. He spent the next morning pacing. He could not tell Emily, not yet. She was the kind of person who would remind him that honesty was worth more than comfort, that what wasn't his should remain untouched. But how could she understand the weight of that box in his hands? How could she tell him not to save her life if he finally had the means to do so? The conflict tore at him until his chest felt raw. He decided to test his thoughts with someone neutral, a man who might know what such a collection was truly worth. He drove to the city, carrying one comic wrapped in a towel. The appraisal shop was small, wedged between a pawn store and a locksmith's office. Inside, the air smelled of old leather and varnish. The man behind the counter, gray-haired and bespectacled, lifted his gaze lazily until Michael laid the comic on the table. Then his expression changed entirely. He handled it as though it were glass, flipping the corners gently, examining the spine. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. Michael hesitated. "From an attic I was working on. It was left behind." The appraiser nodded, as if understanding more than he should. He took out a magnifying glass, muttered something under his breath, and after a few minutes, he said, "You know what you have here? This single issue, this one, is worth at least 200,000, maybe more, depending on condition. If there are others like it, you're sitting on a fortune." A fortune. The words landed like a stone in his chest. He drove home without speaking, the comic wrapped carefully in his jacket, his mind a storm of thoughts. Emily's medicine cost more every month. Their insurance was collapsing. His oldest son would soon need college tuition. The car's brakes had started to fail. Everything in his life seemed to crumble just out of reach of what he could afford. And now, as if fate had finally remembered his name, the solution had appeared in the form of a dusty metal box. That night, he sat by Emily's bedside. She was awake, her skin pale, her smile faint but real. He watched her hands, thin and trembling, resting against the quilt she'd made years ago when their lives had still been light. He wanted to tell her everything, the attic, the comics, the letter, but the words stuck in his throat. She spoke first, sensing his unrest. "Something's on your mind," she whispered. He only shook his head, saying he was just tired, though exhaustion had nothing to do with it. When she fell asleep again, he returned to the garage. The comics lay open on the table, the light casting soft reflections on their glossy covers. He realized then that the letter's message wasn't a command, it was a test. Whoever found them was being asked to choose between need and virtue, between survival and integrity. He thought about the men he'd known, co-workers who'd cut corners, stolen supplies, lied for an extra paycheck. He'd always prided himself on being different. But tonight, that pride felt hollow. What was the worth of honesty when it couldn't heal the person you loved most? The hours passed, the house quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the wind brushing against the siding. He stared at the box until the first light of dawn crept through the window. His reflection shimmered faintly in the metal, a man torn between gratitude and guilt. He realized that this discovery had not saved him. It had divided him. He could feel two versions of himself forming. The man who would sell everything and save his wife, and the man who would return it all and live with nothing but peace of conscience. He didn't yet know which one he would become. Outside, morning arrived, gray and uncertain. Michael walked to the sink, washed his hands, and looked out the window at the empty yard. The earth smelled of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, soft and steady, as if counting his remaining choices. Behind him, in the quiet of the garage, the box sat closed again, patient as ever. Whatever was inside had waited half a century for someone like him. It could wait a little longer. But the decision, he knew, would not. The next morning, the world seemed quieter, as if the night had taken something from him and left behind only stillness. Michael woke before sunrise, though he hadn't really slept. The box remained in the garage, sealed again, its weight pressing against his thoughts. He moved through the morning rituals coffee, a glance at the medicine bottles, a note for the children, but every action felt hollow. He watched the light creep across the kitchen floor and realized he could no longer live in the pause between decisions. He had to choose what kind of man he would be before the silence consumed him completely. When he stepped outside, the air was cold enough to bite. The streets were empty, wet from a light rain that had passed in the night. His truck started reluctantly, the engine coughing as if echoing his own hesitation. The road to Mrs. Donovan's house wound through quiet neighborhoods, past houses that all looked the same, places he had repaired, patched, and painted over the years. He had left pieces of himself in every wall and floorboard, yet none of them truly belonged to him. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He was about to return something he could never claim, something that had come into his life like a test he hadn't studied for. When he pulled up to the old Donovan house, it looked even older than before. The shutters hung unevenly, and the porch sagged a little more. The world around it seemed to fade at the edges, swallowed by fog. Mrs. Donovan was sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, a mug of tea beside her. She looked up when she saw his truck, her expression unreadable, a faint curiosity mixed with fatigue. He carried the box to the porch, its weight heavier than when he had first lifted it, though he knew nothing inside had changed. She met him at the door, her eyes sharp beneath their kindness. "Mr. Harrison, I wasn't expecting you again so soon," she said softly. He nodded and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. He stood awkwardly, his hat in his hands, unsure how to begin. For a moment, he considered lying, saying he'd found old newspapers or junk. But something in her gaze told him that deceit would not survive here. "There's something I found in your attic," he said finally. "Something that belongs to your family." He placed the box on the kitchen table, brushing off the dust with his sleeve. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out to touch it. "My father's attic," she murmured. "He spent half his life up there after my mother passed. I thought he'd just kept old books." She hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of the lid. "You opened it?" Michael hesitated before nodding. "I did. I shouldn't have, but I did." He expected disappointment, perhaps anger, but instead she sighed, a long, fragile sound. "I suppose it was meant to be found someday," she said quietly. When she lifted the lid and saw the comics inside, her breath caught. Her eyes glistened, not with greed, but with recognition. "He told me once that stories could keep a person alive," she whispered. I didn't understand what he meant. I do now. They sat together at the table for a long while, the weight of years unfolding between them. She told him about her father, a printer who had survived the Great Depression by salvaging discarded pages from publishing houses. He'd believed stories were a kind of hope, something worth preserving when everything else crumbled. He'd hidden the comics, she said, because he feared the world would sell them for their ink instead of reading them for their truth. Michael listened, feeling a strange warmth spread through the cold place in his chest. It felt as though the man from the letter was no longer a stranger, but a kindred spirit, someone who had lived by the same code of work, honesty, and quiet endurance. When he finished explaining how he had found the box and what the appraiser had told him, Mrs. Donovan was silent for a long time. Then she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes after a long storm. "He always said these would find the right person," she murmured. Maybe he was right. She reached for one of the comics, turning it gently in her hands. "He'd be happy to know someone like you was the one who found them." Michael shook his head. "I don't know about that," he said quietly. "I almost sold them all. I thought about it more than I'd like to admit." Her eyes met his, steady and calm. "That's why you didn't," she said simply. "Good people don't stay good because they never think of doing wrong. They stay good because they choose not to." The words struck him harder than he expected. He realized she was right. Every decision he had made since finding that box, every sleepless night, every battle between guilt and desperation, had led him here, to this moment of returning what was never his to keep. They agreed that she would take the comics to a museum or trust company for safekeeping, ensuring they would be preserved properly. But before he left, Mrs. Donovan insisted on something unexpected. She took a smaller stack of issues from the box, 5 in total, and slid them toward him. "Your wife," she said softly. "You said she's ill. Keep these. Sell what you must, but only these." It's what he would have wanted. Michael tried to refuse, but she placed her hand on his. "You honored his legacy by returning what wasn't yours. Now, honor your own by taking what you need." Her words left no room for argument. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As he walked out of the house, the morning light cut through the fog, spreading in pale bands across the street. The box was lighter now, but it felt no less significant. In the weeks that followed, he sold only 1 comic, just enough to cover Emily's treatment and the cost of repairing their roof before winter. The rest he kept sealed in a wooden chest, wrapped carefully in cloth, as though preserving the weight of that moment. The sale paid for the surgery that gave Emily a second chance. When she came home, pale but smiling, the house seemed to exhale with relief. The children filled the rooms with laughter again, and though Michael never told them the full story, they sensed something in him had changed. He moved differently, slower, more deliberate, as if aware of the invisible line he had walked and returned from. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The old Donovan house was sold at last. Michael helped with the repairs before the new owners moved in, patching walls and sanding floors. In the attic, he noticed the spot where the box had once been hidden. The plank he'd lifted was now replaced, new and smooth, but he could still feel the memory of the hollow space beneath it. It felt strange to leave it behind, as though a part of himself would remain there, waiting quietly in the dust. Back home, he built a small shelf in his workshop. On it, he placed 1 framed comic book, the one he'd kept, Action Comics #1. Beneath it, pinned to the wood, was a copy of the letter he had found. The words had faded slightly from handling, but he could still read them clearly. "Let them help you in your hour of need, but never forget what they stand for." Every evening, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the house grew quiet, he would sit in the workshop and look at the frame. He thought of Mrs. Donovan, of her father, of the invisible thread that had tied their lives together across decades. He thought of the way life seemed to know when to test a man's soul, and how, if he listened closely enough, it also offered the means to mend it. Emily would sometimes join him there, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. She would glance at the framed comic and smile, though she still didn't know the full story. "You've been different since that attic job," she said once. "Calmer. Lighter, somehow." He smiled back, but didn't answer. There were some things words couldn't carry without losing their meaning. In time, the world moved on. The story of a hidden comic collection surfaced in a local newspaper after Mrs. Donovan's donation, though Michael's name was never mentioned. He didn't need it to be. The knowledge of what he had done, and what he hadn't done, was enough. Years later, when he built their new home, something modest but sturdy, standing on a quiet hill, he used the same care he had always given other people's houses. The floors were level, the beams true, the roof sound. On the day they moved in, he carried the framed comic last, setting it on the mantel above the fireplace. The firelight reflected off the glass, glinting faintly like gold. Sometimes, when he was alone, he imagined that somewhere beyond the walls, the man who had written the letter was still watching. He hoped that if that man could see him now, his wife safe, his children grown, his hand still building, he would understand that his inheritance had not been wasted. And in the stillness of those late hours, when the air carried the faint scent of sawdust and rain, Michael would whisper a quiet thanks. Not for the money, not for the comics, but for the reminder that some treasures are not meant to be kept. They are meant to find the right hands, and in doing so, make the world a little more honest. The house, his house now, creaked softly in the wind. He closed his eyes and listened. It was the same sound he had heard years ago in the Donovan attic, the slow breathing of wood and time. But now, instead of secrecy, it carried peace. He smiled to himself and let the silence settle around him, certain at last that the inheritance had chosen well. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more real stories like this. Watch the next video, and don't forget to share this one with your friends.